question, I've just been convinced for a very long time that understanding teenagers, and specifically for my context, understanding middle schoolers, it's the second most important thing I can do to increase my effectiveness in youth ministry. The number one, I think, is kind of obvious, and that's to really continually try to invest in my relationship with Jesus, because great ministry flows out of that. It doesn't matter how skilled and how many tricks I have. If I'm not operating out of the overflow of a vibrant relationship with Jesus, then it's nothing. I'm just a gong, right? Yeah. But then after that, the second most important thing, I'm so convinced, is this deeply understanding them. I'd say that even it's true for all ages of teenagers, and understanding their brains is where it all flows from. Because when you think of the dramatic changes that all teenagers are going through, it all revolves around the changes that are taking place right in here. So yeah, I mean, my understanding of their developmental issues impacts everything I do in youth ministry, from my content of my talks to the topic of my talks to how I lead a small group to my interaction with individual kids or their parents to my program schedule to everything that I do. And so I think it's critical that youth workers learn about this, whether they're a full-time professional with 25 years of experience or whether they're a brand new volunteer rookie. They've got to learn what's going on that makes teenagers unique.
Yeah.
And more than the cultural stuff.
So
love
good.
it. And that's so challenging because, like we said, most of us are not thinking about this in youth ministry, right? We're worried about what we're teaching. We're worried about making sure the game is fun. We're not studying the teenage brain. So this is going to be super helpful. And you kind of shot us over 3 things about the teenage brain that we're going to talk about. But before we dive into that, you mentioned some books, and we mentioned some books actually that we've read of yours, and you've been studying this and writing about this for years. So before we get into these 3 things, are there any books that you recommend you've written, or some topics in those books that we won't be able to cover today but are important to know?
Yeah, probably the best way to think of this is that we're going to talk today about 3 sexy new things about teenage. It's probably a really bad talking about
no, it's great.
3 super fun newer discoveries that have big implications, should have big implications. But really, ultimately, if you want to understand teenage development and what's going on in the minds and bodies of the teenagers you're working with, you have to learn about the onset of abstract thinking. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's probably the biggest deal when it comes to understanding teenagers. So find something about, there's lots of great books on that. I've written 4 books that cover that myself, but there are others too that are really, really important. You've got to read something on that.
All right. So the concept of abstract thinking is something we should probably go look up. And then today we've got some newer things that are kind of fresher that we need to talk about. So let's kind of just dive right into those. What are those things about the teenage brain that we should understand as youth workers?
Okay. First, let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. Do this with me, guys.
All right, here it is.
So, everybody watching, do it too. Right there behind your hand, in the front of your head, is your prefrontal cortex. It's 2 lobes of your brain, the frontal lobes. And thanks to the invention of the MRI roughly 15 years ago, and its acceptance as a non-invasive way to look at healthy, live teenage brains, there was a giant discovery. Oh my gosh! The entire medical and scientific community for hundreds of years had a wrong conclusion about brains. They said that brains were fully developed on average by age 6 or 7. And it wasn't until the MRI, shock of all shocks, that we discovered, no, the brain isn't fully developed until the mid to late 20s.
Wow.
What? And this prefrontal cortex is one part that is significantly underdeveloped in teenagers. Now, why does that matter? Well, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for some pretty important things. It's responsible for, among other things, decision-making, wisdom, prioritization, impulse control, risk management, empathy. What? I mean, this is really, really big stuff. And so you can see why, with that being underdeveloped, it explains why teenagers struggle with decision making and why they struggle with impulse control or risk management.
Yeah.
Now, listen, guys, that's an important finding, and it's helpful to understand. But I think almost more critical is the framing that we interpret it with.
Yeah.
Because what I find that people tend to either have a view of teenagers, and maybe you've heard me say this before, Kenny and Al, that either they view teenagers as a problem to be solved or as a wonder to behold. Right? And that's a giant question that we all need to wrestle with. Do we view teenagers as a problem to be solved or as a wonder to behold? And be honest with yourself. I think that 98% of North America views teenagers as a problem to be solved. Even most of our churches view them as a problem to be solved. Yeah. Now, if you bring a problem to be solved lens to this research about an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, then your conclusion is, well, look, of course, we've always known that teenagers were bad at decision making. Now we have scientific proof. So what we should do is not give them decisions. We should isolate them even more. We should remove responsibility, and we should treat them as if they were children, which are giant pendulum swings we're seeing take place in our country right now. And that does damage to teenagers. If we, on the other hand, look at it as a wonder to behold, and we view them through that lens, then we start to ask, what might God's creation intention have been in creating teenagers to have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex? And I think there's lots of great possibilities, but certainly one for us in youth ministry is teenagers, because of their wired propensity for risk and passion, should be, when allowed, a gift to our churches, right? Because they will do things that others wouldn't do. Yeah.
Wow.
That's so good.
That is crazy. I love it. I love hearing you just talk about this stuff because I'm into science and like not only just like learning about it, but the implications of how that should affect how we minister and how we, understand teenagers. And so that's amazing. A problem or a wonder. I just love, that's so good. All right. So that's number one, kind of understanding and being aware of the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex.
Yes.
Let's talk about number two.
Number two is big word alert. Ready for the big word alert?
Ready.
Neuron proliferation and winnowing.
Yes.
Okay, here's the deal. 2 years. Let's start with this. The brain has this electrical wiring that's called neurons. Neurons are the electrical wiring of the brain. It's how information moves around the brain. And bundled together, we refer to them as neural pathways, and they're the information superhighways of the brain. Okay? The brain has a fairly static or even amount of neurons, in the billions, by the way, for all of life. So let's consider that as a static line. There's this many neurons until late in life, where I'm just about there, where we start to see the number of neurons starting to decrease, which sounds illogical to us. Except just prior to puberty and just after puberty, there's a spike. 2 years prior to the onset of puberty, we've discovered this again because of the MRI. There is a crazy growth in neurons, and millions of additional neurons are added to the brain. And then at puberty, a toggle switch is tripped, and millions of neurons are winnowed away or culled or eliminated, right? And it's in the young to middle teen years that winnowing process takes place. And so think junior high into about maybe 9th or 10th grade that this winnowing process takes place. And the brain goes back to the number of neurons that existed prior to preteen years. Now, that's interesting and all, and science nerd Kenny might like that, but there's more to it than when it comes to the implications for youth ministry, because the process of eliminating neurons and neural pathways is what's important. The process, according to kind of one of the lead experts in the world on this stuff, he calls it a use it or lose it process. Those neurons and neural pathways that are used heavily during the young and middle teen years get to stay and play for the rest of life. And those that are not used get not just put into a dormant state that they could be revived later, they're actually dismantled. They go away. So, implication for youth ministry, giant question of stewardship. You and I are involved in, I guess I'd call it maybe a minor but important way, in the hardwiring of brains for a lifetime of faith. This same researcher says that their brains are hardwired during their young teen years. And yes, the brain has plasticity and it can learn new things all through life. But the reality is, well, here's an example. If you ever meet somebody who moved to a new country prior to about age 14, then they pick up the accent of the country they moved to. But if you meet somebody who moved to a new country after, just after, at about 15 years old, they retain the accent of their country of birth. That's because of this hardwiring reality. Their brains are hardwired for that particular accent, right? Yeah. So the question for us youth workers is, how do we steward the opportunity that we have to hardwire their brains for a lifetime of faith? And I think so often what our youth ministries focus on is getting the content right, getting your beliefs right. And if that's our focus, then we are hardwiring their brains to be able to repeat back correct information.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, in fact, I've become pretty convinced, the better stewardship is hardwiring their brains for a lifetime of asking questions, wrestling with truth, seeking good answers, processing doubts. I'd rather have their brains adept at that than at repeating the correct answers.
Yeah.
Wow, that's good. And like kind of what you mentioned before, sometimes we want to isolate them from those things, right? We're like, oh, they're too young to wrestle with those things. They're too young to ask those questions. But we miss that opportunity. Like if we hold it until they're 16 or 17, right? And they're like almost ready to go to college before they can really start processing doubts and asking tough questions. We've actually didn't steward that time well, is what you're saying. Right. Allowing them to develop those skills and hold on to those skills for a lifetime.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. So here's a kind of a follow-up question, maybe to put another practical spin on this. So a big thing, I mean, for us as youth pastors is probably like, we want to see our students engaged in spiritual disciplines in some way, you know, reading the Bible, praying on a regular basis. But I know for me, especially as a young youth worker, and probably for a lot of us out there, we can get discouraged because we see our students like super sucking at having a daily quiet time. Like they don't care, or like they just can't do it, you know? And so some of the things that you've talked about are like, because of the underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex, that they're not good at impulse control, they're not good at kind of predicting the consequences of their actions, kind of things that are important, I would think, for habit formation. But at the same time, you're saying that we need to encourage them to like actually begin some of these practices, or else we're going to miss our window.
It's a super good transition to the third thing that we're going to talk about.
Cool. Nice.
Because it is about developing a habit. And that, the big word that you got, or term that you guys need to learn here, is anterior cingulate. Now, I'll get to that in a second, so put a little pin in it. Okay, I'm going to give you a cross-section of my brain.
Okay.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay. Right up here, we just talked about it, is the prefrontal cortex, right? And the prefrontal cortex is the logical, rational part of the brain. Now, I want you to think for just a moment, if you have a faith that is fueled by a highly developed prefrontal cortex, that's going to be a logical, rational faith. You would even say that an atheist has a faith that is fueled by a highly developed prefrontal cortex, right? Now, back to the profile. This part right here is awesomeness. But besides that, what we're going to look at right here, it's actually a little bit inside of this spot. It's at the between the stem of your spine and right at the base of the brain is this little almond-shaped thing called the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of your brain. It's also anger, but it's dominantly fear. And if your brain has, when you like go into a fear freak out space, you're walking through a haunted house and you get panicked about something, you know, it overrides your prefrontal cortex and you can't think logically or rationally. You might even be aware, I'm not able to think logically right now. You know, even if you didn't use those words, you know, I shouldn't be afraid right now, but I can't seem to get beyond this fear that I'm feeling, right? So they kind of can stamp each other out. Now, I knew about those two. The part of the brain that I've just recently learned about is just fascinating to me. And back to our profile here, it's right in here. It's between the two, between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. We got the shiny thing going here.
That looks great. Yeah.
And it's called the anterior cingulate. It's a buffer zone, and it's right behind the prefrontal cortex. And it acts as a balance between the fear center of the amygdala and the rational, logical thought of the prefrontal cortex. Now, think of these three spaces. If you have a faith that's driven by the prefrontal cortex, logical, rational faith, not such a bad thing, but it kind of lacks the passion and vibrancy that we hope for in faith, right? You know, a lot of people who can rationally and logically explain what they believe, but they seem to have a pretty spiritually dead life, right? Yeah. On the other hand, if you have a faith that's driven by a highly developed amygdala, then you have a fear-based faith that usually shows up as legalism because you're trying to appease a wrathful God. And that's certainly not the faith that we want in our teenagers. But here's it's a really new discovery in the last couple of years. If you have a highly developed anterior cingulate, that allows you to understand and conceive of a God who is compassionate and personal. Two key words. Now, isn't that what we want? We want our teenagers to, and ourselves for that matter, to understand a God who is compassionate and personal. And as we developed an understanding of a God who is compassionate and personal, we also then develop the ability to notice needs in others and exercise compassion toward them. So the big question is, how do we develop our anterior cingulate? If I want to have a faith that's really flowing out of a highly developed anterior cingulate rather than my amygdala or my prefrontal cortex, how do I do it? So the lead researchers on this stuff are two neuroscientists who are not believers. One would describe himself as spiritual, and the other would describe himself as a naturalist. He uses that term instead of atheist because he's trying to avoid the meaning of that. So that adds credibility to me, to this, because they're not trying to build up a belief system that they already had ascribed to. And they say the number one way to build the anterior cingulate is prayer and meditation. And it's got to be kind of hopeful prayer and meditation. It can't be fear-based, right? Yeah. They did one particular study where they got people who had never really experienced prayer and meditation before, and they got them to commit to 8 to 10 minutes a day. They measured the activity of their anterior cingulate before starting and then at multiple points through this process. And by the 2-month mark, those people had experienced an average growth in actual size and functionality of the anterior cingulate by 50%. And that development was permanent, is what the scientists said. And so the reality is, if we can help teenagers develop a habit, and if we ourselves can develop a habit of 8 to 10 minutes a day of prayer and meditation, hopeful, reflecting on scripture or on the characteristics of God, then that will develop this part of our brain that helps to tamp down the fear and help us to understand God is compassionate and personal, which revolutionizes faith. The second most important way to develop the anterior cingulate is faith-based singing. So I've been thinking, you guys, like, it seems to me that maybe one of our top youth ministry priorities, more than anything else, should be helping teenagers develop a daily practice of meditation and singing.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's so good.
Like, if we want them to have a vibrant faith for the rest of life, more than just be entertained and say Jesus is my homeboy for a few years that they're in our groups, we want something more long-lasting than that. Then this is it. And in short, this is how prayer changes us. I'm sure that you all, as have I, have often told teenagers, hey, prayer changes God, but it also changes you. Well, this is scientifically how prayer changes you.
Wow.
Jeepers creepers.
Super encouraging. And like some practical things too. You know, you talk all of this like brain chemistry and whatever, all of this stuff. But then at the end, we have these tangible things that we can actually take back to our ministry and say, all right, let's focus on helping students meditate and pray and sing faith-based
Yeah,
songs.
by the way, they can't just hear them, the songs, and they can't just think them. They actually have to intone them. And doing it a couple times a week, like at youth group, doesn't do anything for the anterior cingulate. It might have a nice value in other ways, but it has to be consistent daily in order for it to actually change the anterior cingulate.
Wow. That is so wild. Oh my gosh. Margot, this is so good. Where can people like learn more about this besides calling you on the phone?
Yeah, so the anterior cingulate stuff, specifically a book called How God Changes